As you may have heard a little bit earlier on, the spokesperson of the MKMVA, Carl Niehaus, has been suspended by the ANC for some of the utterances that he made. And the ANC has warned that members not to continue to engage in acts of ill discipline. The party has temporarily suspended the membership of MKMVA spokesperson Carl Niehaus this afternoon. Over the weekend, thousands of ANC members gathered outside the home of former President Jacob Zuma in Nkandla to support him ahead of imminent arrest. The ANC says that it won't tolerate such behaviour where people gather in large groups during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're going to hopefully get a bit of a sound clip from Carl Niehaus. We spoke to him a little bit earlier this evening, and he says that he's disappointed that he has been suspended, but he did say it's temporary, and he's going to challenge that suspension because he feels that he's free to speak his mind and say what he needs to say. But let's talk to another one of our regular commentators about the situation that's playing out in Nkandla and nationally, I guess, because it is a national story when you have a former president about to be arrested. Angelo Fick has more insights for us. Angelo, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Good evening, Peter, and good evening to your viewers.
All right. I don't like to use words like seminal moment all the time, but given who we're dealing with and what might happen this evening, do you think that this is a significant moment? Let's just look from it from a legal point of view.
I think it is a significant moment. Whether it is sea-changing remains to be seen, but it is significant that for the first time in our democratic dispensation, a politician and former head of state is in a standoff with the institutions of this society and the institutions that are the backbone of this society. And all sorts of questions are being asked with how government has dealt with this particular issue compared to how it's dealt with other issues involving public protest and public defiance under the COVID regulations, but also how it dealt with the student protest before. And so this is a defining moment for the South African government and for the African National Congress and how it deals with problems that arise and a problem of this magnitude.
How do you think at the end of this, the legal, the judiciary, let's call it that, the judiciary will come out looking in the public view, because you have the president and his team painting one picture that he's been a victim and he hasn't really had a fair hearing, he's going to jail without trial. And then on the other, you have commentators and, of course, legal representatives telling another story altogether, almost as if that this man is the architect of his own misfortune. The public have to make up their mind, because at the end of this, they've got to believe that the judiciary is independent and has done the right thing.
So again, there are multiple failures that account for the confusion that we currently sit with. And, it's a complex scene in which those failures unfold. To begin with, Timothy Snyder, a professor of political philosophy of the United States, talking about tyranny, particularly around the Trump presidency and the run-up to the Trump presidency, says that you have to watch against tyranny. And two of the things that you have to do, he mentions about 15 of them, is that you have to, one, watch out for paramilitaries, and two, you have to protect and defend institutions. And this is not to say that institutions are beyond criticism or beyond critique. The institutions are open to criticism and should be critiqued because they need to change as the society changes. But it's interesting that people who support Mr. Zuma or his view of things and his version of things seem to want to delete from history his own words, his own actions that are available to anybody who has access to a device that will give you access to the internet, and that we've been witness to those events in the last 3 months, never mind the last 10 to 15 years. As for the judiciary, whether or not they weather the storm in the public eye depends entirely on how in public we defend the institution even as we critique it, and that means all of us in South Africa. And to what extent government responds within the letter of the law and within the spirit of the law, rather than trying to seek out political solutions. because we cannot be held to ransom in a society by people who once had power. What happens to the person who defies a magistrate's court order for child maintenance should happen to Mr. Jacob Zuma, private citizen. There should be no distinction in the treatment of these people. Because if we allow people who sway power or imagine they have power to do this, we become a state that becomes entirely a society that becomes entirely enforced to people with power. And in a society with organized crime, such as South Africa, that would set an incredibly dangerous precedent that we can ill afford to have.
And is this a moment in terms of politics for the ANC and for South Africa?
Absolutely. This is an election year. The governing party does not want to have the same sad faces that it had in 2016 after those local government elections, where it got trounced. And it does face weakened opposition, and opposition weaker than it has ever been in the post-apartheid period. But that does not mean that voters won't turn their backs on what they see as any kind of betrayal of the mandate that the party holds up in public in its rhetoric when it talks against corruption. If it protects anybody from the rule of law, we cannot have repeated the situation we had with Omar al-Bashir, where the state essentially and the government attorneys essentially told us that they couldn't find Mr. Omar al-Bashir, even though people were circulating photographs of the plane taking off. We can't violate domestic law and expect ordinary South Africans to obey the same laws. If we want a law-abiding, rule-based society, we must obey those laws. If we find the laws unacceptable, there are mechanisms in place in the constitutional democracy to challenge those laws. We have the separation of powers, and we have all sorts of processes. Inadequate as they are means by which to oppose laws that you think unjust. But defying the law, simply ignoring it and thumbing your nose at processes, and the analogies that are being used by comparing this situation to an apartheid South African situation is to debase the struggle against the suffering of communities and its exigencies. In the United Democratic Front, the Mass Democratic Movement, the 1980s, the paranoia of those last years of apartheid, it is to spit in the memory and in the faces of those people who paid the price. And the fact that somebody who 40 years ago was part of that struggle is now at the center of this, again, a test for our politics. Do we stand by principle? Do we stand by institution? Or do we descend into personality cults that give us the very same problem that this particular man, Jacob Zuma, stood up in front of a university audience on a university campus in 2013 and said, we are not like other Africans generally. If we want to maintain this myth of our own exceptionalism, for which there is no substance, we certainly have to defy all of the previous lessons on this continent of people who chose personality over principle, people who chose the politicians over the state.
What next then for us as ordinary citizens watching this play out? The ANC is a political party because a lot of people are wanting to know, when we wake up tomorrow, will there be chaos and mayhem if Jacob Zuma is arrested? Or are we talking this up to a point that it's bigger than it really is?
I think it is bigger than it really is, the threat of violence. If there is violence, the people engaged in the violence would certainly have to take responsibility for that and for instigating it. We've had no less than, on-record threats of such violence by implying that they will happen. Now, if an ordinary person, again, was in a magistrate's court and was, ordered to appear on a second or third occasion for evasion of public health, of child maintenance, you would certainly not indulge that person suggesting that they will not come back to court, and if they're going to be arrested, they will go out in a blaze of glory with gunfire. This would be considered unacceptable. The threat of violence against state institutions is a form of insurrection. Now, we've had people in this country who went to a parliamentary precinct to protest accused of treason by the post-apartheid South African government. And yet there is a kind of very light approach here. This need not be the drama that it is. I think it's important that citizens observe it and see it for the seriousness that it is. But that doesn't mean it has to descend into melodrama. If the South African police services cannot maintain internal security for a threat from an internal source or sources, that speaks very ill of the stability of the democracy of South Africa. If they could do it to students, if they could stop student protests, if they could quell people standing up against regulations under the COVID, state of disaster, then it seems really ridiculous that they cannot arrest one simple man in a rural space in KwaZulu-Natal. It speaks ill of our ability to manage the internal affairs of this country if this is a failure on the part of the police, which it shouldn't be.
Angelo Fick, we'll leave it there for the time being. So much still to play out, if it does play out this evening, but I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about again tomorrow. Thanks so much indeed for joining us tonight.